Good evening and thank you for coming in this our first after Easter meeting. As you may know or have been informed that our Easter service was so full of people that they were standing all along the walls, but of course now we are sort of the noble remnants of the great crowd. So keep that in mind. And I also need to extend an explanation or an apology, whichever you think is more appropriate, about the title of this evening's talk. And that was particularly because when I gave my friend the titles to put on the bulletin, there was all kinds of confusion going on with all the meetings for Easter and so forth, so that there was the usual confusion. So in course of the usual confusion, I had mentioned over the telephone various sort of individual items which are really not appropriate for a title, but I was describing generally sort of what I thought I would be talking about, and that came onto the printed page. So when people see that, then we are amazed about the mental balance of the speaker. So, which probably is a matter of amazement to them already. But in any event, all of these things added up to a curious mixture which will be your program this evening. So let me see now what I had in mind and what I still have in mind is the fact that profound subjects and profound topics do find their way into common usage by way of trivial individual matters and individual discoveries. And so I thought that what the best way perhaps to begin this little discourse is to mention that the real subject of our discussion this evening was meant to be regarding the character of the United States and the best ways in which we can approach these, especially at the present time. Now you are aware that in all kinds of heraldry, which is the science of coats of arms, we have very often not only a particular heraldic picture, but also some kinds of mottos. And the motto that was chosen by the founding people of the United States was to the effect that there is somebody coming in here, was a very simple motto in Latin, which fortunately I still know, having gone for 8 years to Latin class. I would have had to be a dunce not to remember some of it. You know that there is there is a Latin motto that was designed for the United States and that is hardly ever remembered nowadays, and that is E pluribus unum, from the many, the one. And I think that to keep that in mind when discussing these curious subjects would probably be a considerable help. Now, one of the reasons why I am fond of that particular motto and various things connected with it is that many years ago, at least 40 years ago or something of that sort, my good friend who sits over there with his grey hair, John O'Neill, had indicated to me that what a great and unusual role the Hudson Valley in the upper state of New York and those areas really played in the history, general history and the history of the nation. And so I will use that same. So I started reading about the history of the Hudson Valley and of all the almost innumerable, unusual and weird people, probably including ourselves in modern times, had come there and held their activities and their services for years upon years upon years. Now the Hudson Valley is, I found the Hudson Valley where I then returned a number of times, primarily again because of John, who urged me to come there because we still do, we had a theosophical campsite there where people come on weekends and so forth, and so I was doing my usual thing of holding lectures there. And in the course of that, various kindly people, including John, would take me around to the various communities in the Hudson Valley, where every time you go to any one of them, and there are many, because there are many little settlements, many little towns along the Hudson Valley, all the way up to where the state capital is, let's see, which? Albany. Yes, Albany. So if you want to see unusual historical places, that's the way to go. You just go after one after the other and get a feel of the content of these places, because primarily because these are the remnants of much of the beginning of our country. And especially people interested in spiritual things, while each and every one of these places that you find that way is the remnant of some odd, generally unaccepted and maybe generally treated with suspicion spiritual group. So that over the years, the Hudson Valley became a habitat of innumerable spiritual or religious groups who found the area to their liking and therefore settled there. And even when they are no longer there, many of them, of course, then disappeared. The particular habitat that where they worked and where they lived is still there, so that you can you can gain an impression with some imagination as to what kind of unusual people went to the Hudson Valley to express their soul and their spirit. So it's really a very interesting place. In fact, if there is anyone here who has, number one, a lot of money, and number two, a lot of time, I would advise that you take a trip up there and then just go starting over by the ocean, go one by one to visit the places where the strange founding people of the United States came. And they came primarily because they didn't want to go anywhere else. They were able to live their lives, express their spiritual longings and so forth in that area. And then often they moved from there to the next one. If you look at Mitch Horowitz's recent book, Modern Occultism, which I have recommended and still recommend, you can find there one after the other as you go up the Hudson Valley, the strange and often no longer active spiritual groups, religious groups that have occupied that territory, built their little churches, and brought in others of their like-minded followers. And let's say, I can't really express it in any other way, but they created an atmosphere which is still there, and which I think is very interesting, because by sniffing it out, by feeling it out, you get some impression of the kind of interests, the kind of dedications, the kind of activities that went on in the Hudson Valley for such a long time. And with that, we may also combine a little speculative aspect by saying that, you know, this was the original America. That's what it was. This was the original United States. And therefore, what you feel there, what you see there, what you touch there, is part of that. Of course, almost every hamlet that you go to will show you one or more places where George Washington slept and kept his horses and all of that. So, you know, there are direct historical connections available too. But it is well known that the majority of the people who came to the Hudson Valley and established their various little places there and remained often for decades were people interested in very unusual and very spiritual things. And so, once again, I recommend Mitch Horowitz's book, because quite a few of them are listed there. And you got to remember that the time period that we are speaking about is also coincides with the rise of spiritualism in America, which was, let's say the friends of ghosts, you know. And it started in the state of New York, in Hydesville, New York, where some young people, some young children were quartered, and they in turn, with their childish intuition, made a connection with some spirits. and particularly I think one or two spirits who had some kind of connectedness with that building in which they were living at that time. And that was the beginning of spiritualism the world over. As I say, I never liked that term spiritualism very much because I think it's a bit misleading. There are other and maybe a little more complex and in some ways more interesting disciplines that than the ones that I am mentioning now, which could be called spiritualistic, mainly because they have to do with the spirits of some people who had lived there, who had died there, or had some other connection with it. It's important to remember that as the result of the Hydesville, New York manifestations, a worldwide movement, religious movement, calling itself spiritualist, developed and was very, very well known all over the United States, but also had its outreach over the world, and only one place gave it a different name. Who that was? The people who always want to have everything their own way, the French. And because in French, under the leadership of Allan Kardec, who also had that was his stage name, so to say, but a very great leader and a great medium, the spirit, there came the French name Spiritism, which I think is much more descriptive because it's the people who believe in spirits. Well, in any event, that is maybe not of very great importance, but let's say that something went on in the Hudson Valley, and much of it for a long time, because there are old buildings there now that served as churches of spiritualists, of early Mormons, of all kinds of people that you can visit. And if you are the slightest bit sensitive to unusual influences, you will probably recognize their presence there. So let's say that if we can take the Hudson Valley experience as a particular paradigm of very early America, I think we can come up with some interesting conclusions. Now, in the rarest of instances, was there any presence manifesting that was of Native American or American Indian origin? Although there were some, but very few. The rest of them were all, like ourselves, whiteys. And all of that, I think, indicated that a very interesting conglomeration of national and tribal related forces, especially in the field of religion, had congregated there, and many of them for a very long time. And if you trace kind of the descent of some of these groups to their origins and subsequently, you find that there was a great deal of desire, of searching, of looking for unusual forces and beings in the Hudson Valley and environs by these people. So that a lot of these people, with some notable exceptions, were less true believers, as we often call them, as they were explorers. And it was out of this desire for exploration in the non-physical realm that in many movements that became subsequently very important, not only in the Hudson Valley, but all over the United States and all over the world, came into existence. One of them, at least in part, also of the same kind, was none other than the Theosophical Society, because Madame Blavatsky was also quite familiar with the Hudson Valley, and many of her disciples went there and so forth, so that, let's say, Christian Science, the Mormons, all of these had some roots in the Hudson Valley establishments. And I must say that I'm not a habitual ghost hunter, so I cannot very well tell one place where ghosts have cavorted from another one where they didn't. But I must say that that whole neck of the woods, if you travel down slowly, smoke a cigar or a pipe or something like that, just to keep you busy, you will recognize that the great majority of these unusual groups who settled there, who had their places of worship, who did their ritual dances and various activities, were very sincere, very well organized people who in turn had a very definite spiritual orientation. Much of it was connected along spiritualist lines with the spirits of the dead. And you got to remember that a lot of this, as time went on, not really in the earliest times, but subsequently, was in the wake of martial encounters, of wars, even now. If you get some mediums and send them to Iran right now, and so they'll be probably giving you interesting messages, because the world, and especially those areas where they died, is full of the dead. It's undeniable that is the case. Now, whether you like that, and whether you don't, whether you interpret it one way or whether you interpret it another way, that's up to you. But it seems that for a very, very long time in the history of the human race, there has been a preoccupation with the dead, or with the so-called dead, and that preoccupation in turn led to various results. And so there developed what sometimes has been called the revelatory spiritualism, which was not only concerned with, well, I'm Uncle Joe, I'm so glad that I can talk to you, and so forth, hope to see you next time, not a kind of trivial interaction, which if you have been moving around in spiritualist circles is not a stranger to you. I have done so long ago, and I must say that I encountered a great deal of references to trivial, uninteresting information and things of that sort as the result of that. And I had a good friend through the journal, a dear lady who has now passed away herself, having been talking to the spirits for many years, she finally joined them. But you know, she always said, well, what do you expect? What you are doing is you're getting the voices of people. And these are people who are still interested in the same stuff that they were interested in earlier. And of course, you may judge the value of the communications by that also, but you got to keep that in mind. And so, obviously, these situations are always complex. One of them being that it would seem, and I have noticed that to work that way, that spirits or entities, let us say, of a non-physical nature, do seek out places that are in some way affinitized to their own nature. In other words, there are places that attract the spirits, or the spooks, as Madame Blavatsky would call them derisively, or others, and there are others that are not. And so apparently the whole Hudson Valley area is one of those places that attracts unusual influences. And for that reason, it was and is also of some special interest to me. Now the French, on the other hand, under the leadership of Allan Kardec, whose real name was Léon Hippolyte Denisard Rivail. So my aged memory is not that bad. That was his real name. But he took a nom de plume, as it's called in French, and the nom de plume was Allan Kardec. You know, where you still find a lot of connections with Allan Kardec in his French spiritualism in South America, especially in Brazil. And Brazil has the largest spiritist, not spiritualist, but spiritist communities in the world. And then there are still some in. And I must say that little Allan Kardec that I read both in French and in other languages was quite interesting, was a very, very intelligent man. But he had a kind of an idée fixe. And the idée fixe was the souls of the dead. So anything that he encountered that was of interest to him, oh yeah, the spirits, the dead. And you know, a little of that goes a long way. So that's why, let's say, I did not occupy myself with Allan Kardec's writings too much, although he is a good writer, writes in good, beautiful, poetic French, and has really been the founder of the internationally present spiritualist or spiritist, as he would call it, movement. Now, considering that, we need to keep in mind that humanity in every age and in every country has always sought a contact with the generally not available and invisible reality. We have an attraction to the other side, as it might be called, and that fact in itself is of some import, because you wonder why that is. Well, it is probably because the spirits, if you want to call them that, the ghosts, the nature spirits, the angels, are related to us. They are not strangers. We are their relatives and they are our relatives. And therefore, if in some circumstance of life we come close to them, it is not without justification that we should seek some knowledge and some contact and perhaps some conversation. Because conscious beings, whether they have physical bodies or not, like to communicate with each other. That's just the way it is. And therefore, I think and there are, there are many records of people interacting with the spirit world in the Hudson Valley or elsewhere. And if we are really of an inquisitive mind and don't just dismiss some things of this sort because they are strange, then I think we can acquire some information that way. Now, I am not a spiritualist. I don't want to be one, but let's say I respect the great thrust of the spiritualist humanity into the unknown to discover what the ideas, what the ideals, what the aspirations of the disincarnate, of those who are no longer in the physical body might be. And that there may have been a great deal of material of that sort about in those days, particularly after the end of the Civil War, which, as you probably know, has created more war dead than any other military engagement of the United States of America. So incredible number of people died in the Civil War, and therefore, if we take that expression, there were a heck of a lot of spirits around. And if we take those things in a matter-of-fact fashion, then they're not going to disturb us. The only problem is that in most people, there are at least two factors that I have noticed that play in with this, and they are fear and desire. And the fear is, of course, that we are afraid of the dead. Well, I said very early in my life, well, you know what? I was not afraid of those people when they were alive. Why in the heck should I be afraid of them now when they're dead? But I don't know whether I gained a great deal of approbation with that. So that is one issue. And of course the other one is that there is always a particular stratum of the dead and of their souls, their spirits, on what may poetically be called the other side, that is to be communicated by them to us. At least that is their feeling, that is their desire, that there are many of those who are no longer in their physical bodies who have a desire to contact us, have a desire to give us what they consider to be various forms of information, and perhaps even some items that we would be, they think, we would be interested in being able to utilize in some fashion for our purposes. And so we need to remember that modern occultism, to use Mitch Horowitz's expression, is to a very large extent received its colossal impetus in the world by way of spiritualism. Now, once again, I am not trying to convert you to spiritualism because I've never been converted to it myself. But I know that there are definite phenomena there of an observable nature that can be studied and that under some conditions may reveal data to us that otherwise we wouldn't have. And so we need to keep that in mind, that it is indeed, as I think one of the spiritualists wrote, there is a universally present reality, and in that reality the so-called dead and various other spiritual entities who may never even have lived as humans on earth play a role, and that if we pay attention to them we may learn something, and that indeed the great occultists such as Madame Blavatsky and various others in East and West in various places have done so. If there is a source of interesting and perhaps eventually useful information that comes from the inner planes, if we want to call them, that comes from the spirit world, and it is available to us, why not take advantage of it? On the other hand, don't make a big deal out of it and engage in a revelatory spiritualism, because a lot of the times it seems to me that the spirits, whoever they are, would be anxious to make contact with the quote living. No doubt because they're lonesome, no doubt because especially like in a case after the Civil War, so many of them have been taken out of their physical life by violent and terrible means, and therefore they would like to communicate about these things. And if you are smart and if you want to engage in a certain amount of that, that's all right. The only thing is that in the long run, let's say revelatory spiritualism, which has now been in existence for 150 years or something of that sort since the end of the Civil War, had not produced any theories, any results, any teachings that seem very much worthy of study, of perpetuation, and of dealing with in various fashion in our life world. So that being the case, I wouldn't recommend to anybody to get too involved with the spirits and the spiritists, because I have not seen anything very exciting and transformative to arise out of such meetings. On the other hand, if you have a mother, you have a stepfather, you have a brother who have deceased lately or some time ago, and if in some fashion you make contact, it would seem, with that person, since you were aware of that person, you have a connection, you may gain some information that may prove useful. So that much about the spirits of the dead. Now, that being the case, I think that maybe I'm exaggerating, which I am which is not an activity that I disdain. Sometimes, sometimes in order to really make a point, you have to exaggerate. You really have to give it to people, because otherwise they're not going to listen to you. To make an impression is a very important part of revelatory discourse, and so we have to keep that in mind. And also, if we keep our eyes open and want to be aware of manifestations within this general field, quite irrespective of the historical period or otherwise, then that is also a helpful issue. Because if, let's say, I try to pick some little incidents from my own life, going clear back to childhood or so. When, for instance, I mention this sometimes because it's such a glaring example of these things. My father had an intimate good friend, a gentleman who used to come to our house a great deal, and he always had his pipe in his mouth. And he always smoked the same tobacco. It was a pleasant tobacco. Alistair Crowley, I think, smoked his own tobacco too, which he greatly valued. In any way, this had nothing to do with Mr. Crowley. So let's just say here was this gentleman, and we used to, old, whatever he was, old Uncle Janos, whenever somebody is older than yourself, you address him as uncle in Hungarian. That's just an assumed relationship. Anyway, they said, well, I guess Uncle Janos, or whatever his name was, had some interesting experiences, and so I said to my father, well, he must be around because I keep smelling his tobacco. And not just one day, not just 2 days, but on and on. So my father said, well, sure, he liked that tobacco when he was alive, he still likes it. So let's make him welcome and tell him that he wants to keep smoking his tobacco, he's welcome. And if he finds some more of the same tobacco that maybe he cannot buy where he is, we got to give him some. So, there were all kinds of things of that sort. So let's say the presence of the dead, what in French they would call les revenants, those who come back. Now, if you go a little bit far in that regard, then you end up with vampires and things of that sort, because that's what a revenant, somebody who comes back. Some of them come back for this reason, some of them come back for that reason. But any event, let's say this beginning with the 1840s, this was the great era of spiritualism, as they called it in this country. And the number of people who claimed very often very exciting contact with the other world took place at that time. It grew all over the world. There was a great deal of it in France, in Germany, in all kinds of places. And in fact, if you wanted to have some contact with people who were interested in the unusual, in the mysterious, probably you would find them among the spiritualists most easily, because they had their own. For a while the spiritualists of America had their own daily newspaper. So, these were not uncommunicative people. And a spiritualist woman, a spiritualist person, ran for president of the United States. Now she didn't win, obviously, but she was there. So it was really quite a creative movement. Now, so that is really just surrounding material, but we need to keep in mind that there was a time when in our country, in the United States of America itself, there was you might say, an outbreak of vital interest in the non-physical realities of being, and that this was important. This influenced commerce, it influenced politics, it influenced all kinds of things. And that in itself is a circumstance worth noting. Because why are people so interested in the spirits? Why are they so interested in the, quote, afterlife? Well, for one thing, because they are spirits themselves. And we forget that. We are not just physical bodies, the dying animal that the poet wrote about, but we are connected with the non-physical world in various ways. And that being the case, we should pay attention to these things, because good information that may redound to our benefit in our physical lives is not very easy to come by. I think all the computers of the computer age have spewed forth less valuable information than the, I don't know, about 70, 80 years of spiritualism had in America. The spirits are often smart. If they were not smart, they wouldn't be spirits. They would be somewhere else in some purgatory or the other. So let's say that there was a heavily spiritistic strain in early America, which then moved in its own way and according to its own patterns of development into subsequent centuries, including perhaps our own. And so what we need to keep in mind is what an old gentleman friend of mine used to say: a phenomenon is always worth paying attention to. Now you can find out where the phenomenon comes from, you may find out various circumstances about it, but pay attention to the phenomenon. And the reasons for that could be multiple. One of them being that the overwhelming majority of so-called occult phenomena have come to us with some kind of a purpose. In other words, they don't just come, but they are sent. And that in itself is quite important and should be paid attention to, because the various regions, what the ancients called aeons of the cosmos, the various levels of spiritual and quasi-physical reality have purposes. They have they have intentions. And these intentions may be of value to you when they come through to you, or you may reject them, or maybe you reject them on grounds of some sort. But we are constantly impressed and perhaps even bombarded with non-physical messages, non-physical forces, non-physical communications. Now, does that mean that these communications are necessarily very valuable to us? No. They are valuable to the communicator, but not necessarily to the communicant, because people die, people leave this earth with some intentions, some ideas, some ways in which they wished to continue to influence the world and influence other people. And when they die with those conditions, then the likelihood is that they will continue to seek ways and means whereby to communicate some of these to others. So now comes the question of if you are the potential recipient, what do you do? Well, I would say if the communicator has a message for you that seems of importance, then listen to it. Pay attention to it. You may not find it interesting at all. I have been to seances and all kinds of balderdash like that, and very few of the communications that come through in those situations did I find interesting. But every once in a while there was. And some other people, maybe more perceptive than myself, would receive communications that they really appreciated. Well, I did not appreciate mine. So there are all kinds of conditions of that sort. But let us say, considering our subject, we need to keep in mind that one of the statements of the spiritualists, I think it may have been, I can't think of the name of an famous American medium. One of his statements was that the spirits have something to say, that the other world is here because in large measure because of us, because with its goodwill it may not wish to have us make the same mistakes that they did, and a lot of things of that sort, and that therefore they should be paid attention to. And I think that to a great extent that is true. Also, we must remember that some very valuable messages, some very useful communications have been transmitted from heaven knows where, but by mediumistic, psychic, clairvoyant, whatever we wish to call it, individuals, and then turned out to be true and having some importance so that the communication could be used. And one of these, even though some of my fellow theosophists may not like me saying that, but I delight in occasionally saying things that they disagree with, This has kept me alive. This has kept me alive for many years. that I could disagree with people, and they could disagree with me, and that some of them were very important theosophists, they were writing books and this and that. But I found some kink in their message, and they said, look at this, you're wrong, you're putting forth things here that you shouldn't. And in those cases, of course, I remained victorious, but defeated at the same time. You got to be careful with things like that. We have somebody standing in the door. Is that true? Come on in, brother. No. Don't you worry. Sure. I wouldn't like to stand in the door listening to myself. Yeah, it would be undoubtedly boring. But let us say, put it this way, that when we look at the situation in as holistic and total a manner as we are able, we should keep in mind that we live in an intercommunicative reality, and that communications, signals, signs are all around us. And the reason that we don't pay attention to them is primarily because we don't understand them, or we haven't paid enough attention to them to try to understand them. So we have to be alert and intelligent and capable of understanding especially the unusual things that may come to us. And the things that we've been talking about are precisely such unusual things. Also, we need to keep in mind that up to a certain extent, but all things in moderation, including moderation. Yeah. So this is not a point to be exercised too much. That when there are some interesting elements coming our way, they may be ultimately, when properly treated, may be understood and be to our advantage, or in other cases they may not. So not everything that comes from the astral plane or anything of that sort is necessarily useful to us. Because if it is so useful, why don't they keep it where it is and deal with it, which is maybe a facetious remark, but facetious remarks are useful too, So we have to keep in mind that just because something is occult, just because something is spiritualistic, just because something addresses itself to another dimension, it may not even be particularly true, but it may have enough veracity to pay it some attention and to derive from that attention that we have paid certain benefits. Because the spiritualists were right when they said that we live in an unobstructed universe. That's the one whom I was beginning to quote, and then I forgot my quotation. In any event, there are things being disclosed which may be very much to our benefit. There may be things disclosed which are not to our benefit, and we have to know the difference. So that has been the situation with the whole psychic field. And that is why it is sometimes helpful to consult or pay attention to people who are seers or prophets or clairvoyants in touch with the other worlds and get the information from them. For instance, there is one clairvoyant whom I trusted implicitly, and I still do, and that was Mr. Geoffrey Hudson. And that was primarily because I had met him in person. He had disclosed some things to me about myself, which I found helpful, and because I just sensed a real kindly and good man in him. And you know, good people are not easy to find in this world. I'm sure that has occurred to you. In any way, his books are still around. I would particularly recommend the book, The Kingdom of the Gods, from which many illustrations which were drawn on the basis of his disclosures went into the windows, the colored glass windows which we have here. Everything you see here, including the smaller windows, are based on the clairvoyant pictures of Mr. Geoffrey Hudson, who was a very, very interesting and very fine man, and whom I had the privilege of meeting a couple of times. The last times when I went to New Zealand, he was already too old to see people. And that's how I sent it out. I said, all right, I'll be too old to see people too one of these days. But not yet. No, not yet. But in any event, let's say sources of insight, sources of information, and so on, are not that easily come by. But of course we have to look at the source. And there are sources which become messed up and corrupted and things of that sort. But now, you know, let us keep in mind that the United States of America was founded and managed on and off for a long time by people who believed in and were seeking the unusual side of life. This is not a prosaic nation. It was not founded by prosaic people. It was not founded by people who want to turn everything into money. Although they like money, I can understand that. I never had much of it, so in any event. But the important thing is that there are sources of information which we may look at and then make our own judgment. And I think that this country has been inducted into a zone of contact with the other world early in its development, clear back when the little old ladies and the little old witches and so forth were tromping around in the Hudson Valley and so forth. And that much of that information and the whole ambience is valuable. In fact, I would venture to suggest at this occasion that we could use a little more clairvoyants and visionaries and prophets and mediums right now in this land, in this country, because we are stuck in a prosaic, stupid mindset which values machines higher than the human consciousness and the human mind. You can go to the end of the world, you can go to the end of time, and you will never find anything as interesting, as lovely, as transformative and informative than the human mind. pay attention. It has been given to you for purposes. It has been given to you for purposes of knowing, of what the ancients called gnosis. And if we utilize these opportunities, they will help us a great deal. Always say, well, how many psychics and clairvoyants and mediums did I know who died dirt poor? Yeah, that's quite possible. But maybe enriching themselves was not the purpose of their unusual experiences and their unusual gifts. We should not judge people's consciousness by the fact that they have unusual experiences. An unusual experience is not worth much until you discover within it or through it a meaning. Meaning is the great transformative and progressive force of the universe. I am convinced that if we were transported this minute to a celestial body like the moon, where some of our fellow humans have just been, we would find some meaning. If we don't find meaning, we are not doing something right. We are not doing something right. Because meaning makes us transform. Meaning makes us spiritually alive. Meaning, the discovery of meaning and its utilization makes us ultimately wise and into true human beings. Now, what differentiates somebody like Madame Blavatsky, whom I revere very greatly, and others of less perspicacity, is that she zeroed in, if you mind to use that term, zeroed in to the meaning of her experiences. When she was studying alchemy as a young girl, as a teenager, and discovered an important meaning there, as we have in the Quest magazine of about a year ago, then she was someone who was seeking and finding meaning. You know, let us do likewise. It doesn't make any difference whether X, Y, Z likes the kind of meaning that we find, or the process whereby we look for meaning. The important thing is that something deeply within us, something planted there before the beginning of time and the beginning of the universe, had placed in us the ability to discover profound meaning and thereby move into the path of transformation, into the greater life, into that which is even beyond all spirits, but it goes past the path of spirits. So let us look at this phenomenon in a sense that there may be something there that is important for us to learn. Now, it doesn't mean that we should swallow whole every weird thing that comes along. I think the majority of spiritualist disclosures that I encountered were not particularly valuable to me. But we should look, and we should look particularly for meaning. Does it mean something to me? Does it disclose a greater area of meaning within which I can engage and make grow my talents? If it is, then go for it. Why? Because that is why you're here. You are not here to just punch computers. You are not just here to get excited over a war in the Middle East. You are here to become wise. You are here to become a knower. Because when you know the real, then the real becomes yours. And then from there everything will disclose itself in the most magnificent, in the most helpful, and the most salvific manner. So I hope that these little nudges will be useful to you, and we'll look a little further into the unusual world next time, and I hope that you did not consider it too dull, and I promise you next time I make it maybe a little bit less dull. So thank you very much for having me, and come back again.